You are now part of the social experiment.
See now where my limit is. Only got no O's.
Really, a lot of this starts with the Great Migration. Great Migration is a time period where you see African Americans moving out of the South in large numbers. This is most particularly around World War II. It started a little before that, but World War II is when it kicks into overdrive because you have a plethora of jobs that are available. So the Midwest, the East Coast, the West Coast, now you got factory jobs. And there's now opportunity because they need labor bad, right? You know, the soldiers that went to World War II were often blue collar workers. They were white men with factory jobs. And once they go overseas, there's nobody to work these jobs, let alone work in the factories that produce the planes and the tanks and so on and so forth. So now there's this opening. And now you have white women, and black men working in factories. Now this is pivotal in 20th century history, right? Because World War II is the basis for the middle class, but it's also the basis for introducing white women to having their own resources outside of their men. In other words, they're working jobs and getting a paycheck for the first time, and they're starting to like it. And this is kind of undergirding the coming feminist movement for them in the late 1960s. For us, it was an opportunity to get out of sharecropping, because sharecropping, I call it America's first credit card. I mean, basically, because we weren't allowed to read or write during enslavement, when we're offered sharecropping jobs, often by the same slave owners that used to own us, as it were, they lied and manipulated the interest in particular. So no matter how well you did in terms of bringing your crops to the market every season, they would manipulate the numbers to where you always stayed in perpetual debt, like a credit card that has such a high interest rate. And if you don't understand anything about interest rates, you know, like I didn't when I was in college, I had a leather jacket that took me 11 years to pay off. The only difference between that and sharecropping is there is no paying it off, even after 11 years. And so many of us figured that out, you know, and so you had people migrating out of the South to get away from, you know, what was available to them. And so we moved into the Northwest. We moved into the Midwest. I mean, we moved into the East Coast, the West Coast, so on and so forth. And here you could have a factory job that had a wage. You might even be able to join a union, which for us was unfathomable, right? I can't, people just can't fire me because they don't like that I'm black anymore. It wasn't quite that cut and dry, but at least having a union meant that you could have some representation, right? So now you have this company pushing in your interest to increase your pay and equitable work environments. This was for black folk. This was, you know, unheard of. So all of this went pretty well until the war ended, and these soldiers came back and reclaimed their jobs. And instead of wanting to go back to the South, many of these black folk ended up moving to the, you know, the kind of south of the city, in the city that they were in, so to speak. This was the creation of the ghetto, right? So we, you know, my era, you know, we talked about the ghetto and hip hop in a very particular way. We kind of glorified it, but we never talked about how it came about, right? It came about because we didn't want to go back down south, and there weren't many jobs left for us in the cities that we moved to for jobs. You still had some black men that were able to be milkmen, and they worked different government jobs, postmen, you know, sometimes you could still work a factory job, but largely unemployment took a different turn after World War II. And so, you know, this is the same time period where they're giving out welfare. And one of the policies they had was the man in the house rule, which suggested that if you as a black family came and needed welfare to establish yourself in this, you know, in these cities where jobs are kind of scarce, you could get welfare support as long as you didn't have a man in the house. And in some instances, they required that he be out of state. He couldn't even be close. So you had a lot of black men and women that negotiated his absence for the sake of the family. It's much of it is portrayed much later as deadbeat dadism, right? Where just black men were just irresponsible, didn't care. But you actually had a lot of families that negotiated it because, you know, you got 8 kids, you got 5 kids, and you can't find jobs. And the only way they can eat is if you're not there. Well, you're a man. You know what I mean? So you had a lot of men that prioritized their families, and they negotiated this with their wives. Many of them tried to maintain a family even though he couldn't be present. This is why they had social workers that would come over unannounced and go through your closets and look for razors in the bathroom to make sure there wasn't a man present.
So, thinking about Claudine right now.
Hey, that was real talk. You know, Claudine was real. So
wow.
that being said, this is the breakup of a lot of families. And really, I will say this about life in the South, particularly in sharecropping environment. There was poverty, there was starvation, there's no question. But the family's living together and spending the majority of its time together, right? You move to the North, now you're introduced to a school day. And we did have the, one schoolhouse kind of thing happen in the South, but it's much more manufactured in the urban North. So what I'm saying is that boys in particular end up spending the majority of their time with women, with their mothers,
Mm.
with female teachers. This is a stark contrast from the South. Yes, the one schoolhouse school in the South that you and every other grade of kids attended, which often had one teacher who was teaching every level at once. That was a woman often in that position, but you came home and you had your brothers, you had your father. They're all kind of there, even though we're sharecropping and we're poor. By the time you get to the urban North, the father's pushed out the home, the mother is there, the teachers are women. The majority of these boys are socialized around women, and they're socialized to serve women. Because from birth to adulthood, you're taking orders from women and everywhere you turn. So this idea that men can't take orders or direction from women is laughable because that's all you did. Even during my childhood, my father, I saw him once a year. Who do you think I was taking direction from, whether in school or at home? It was women. So that said, you had this kind of environment where these young men are growing up really trying to learn manhood on their own. And that even includes my growing up in the 80s. We were trying to learn it and develop it with each other, in this kind of way. And that's kind of what was taking place even as early as in the 60s and 70s. But with the absence of men by policy, what this ends up producing is a narrative that women don't need men. Now, it's one thing in 1965 if you understand that your father had to leave for y'all to eat. What happens after 3 generations? That mother has a daughter who raises a family and goes through the same thing, a granddaughter who raises the family and goes through the same thing. What do you think those 3 generations of women after her are going to learn about men in an environment where by policy they're removed from the home?
You don't need them.
You don't need them. And you have not only access to welfare, you have access to employment. And even during the era in the 40s and 50s and 60s where domestic work was in play, for women, men couldn't get domestic work. It didn't work the same way. Once we were pushed out of the factory jobs, and those jobs eventually by the late 70s went overseas. We had deindustrialization, so those jobs went overseas. That left black men unemployed with very little to operate with. And then we know by the time we get to the mid 70s through the 80s, this is where you start to see the war on drugs, right? Because drugs became the next economy. Black men didn't gravitate to these jobs just because we were stupid or because we weren't. It was the only way to eat for a lot of people because there was nothing left for you as a black male. Right. So that being said, the environment shifted in a manner that impacted the very structure of the black family, and what it taught generations of youth that became adults and raised their own youth was that men were unnecessary, men were a problem. And then in the 70s, we also had the rise of hyper incarceration. Right. So with the drug war, black men are now going to prison. And when you get out, just being at your mama's house can cost her her welfare standing, could cost her whatever, the apartment she may have found. These things further separate black men and women on a variety of levels. And then you get the access to white collar, well, first of all, education, and then white collar employment for women and girls. So if you look at the data from 1976 to about 2019, black men have about half the degrees of black women. Now, it's only about a 5 or 6% difference now in terms of the number of black men in college versus the number of black women. There's about 5 or 6% more black women in college. But from 1976 to now, you can see the extent to which black males were not really a part of that narrative. We have half the degrees they have, meaning those women could go to college so they could get welfare that men really couldn't get and couldn't participate in. Or if they were middle class, they could go to college in numbers that black men couldn't, we couldn't do as well. So either way, whether you were poor or you were middle class working white collar jobs, you had greater help, assistance, access, resources as a woman than you did as a man. But What is the impact this has on the average person in terms of how they interpret black manhood? Black manhood becomes a problem at every level. When you're a little girl, these boys are going to get you in trouble. If you're a teenager, these boys might get you pregnant. If you're a grown woman, these boys are just going to take from you. They're going to eat your food, they're going to get you pregnant and leave you there. This becomes the perception because at the end of the day, black men do not have systemic support the way other groups of people do, male and female, right? Black men in particular are left to their own devices